Maran, who is a professor of Ecosemiotics and Environmental Humanities and head of our Department of Semiotics here in Tartu. And I guess you are all very well familiar with his work, and you know that he's been working with ecosemiotics and ecocriticism and Estonian nature writing and semiotic relations, nature and culture, and he's also a very good poet. And so, well, without any further ado, I leave you with Professor Maran.
Thank you. Let me see if I'm able to share a screen. So, is it also visible from the other side of this? Yeah, very good. Very good. So I will continue to talk about well, difficult problems and crises, but it will not be about the crisis that we have currently in Ukraine, which of course is in our heads and hearts, but another crisis that is related with that, namely the global ecological crisis. But I believe that you can also see the connection between the two, because what is going on in Ukraine today much has to do with the way how Western civilization is relying on fossil fuels and how it subsidizes this war by paying enormous amounts of euros and dollars to Russia. But now the global ecological crisis, it has many faces and many aspects. We can talk about the sixth wave of species extinction, global climate change, loss of biodiversity and natural ecosystems, accumulation of waste and pollution, a decrease of fresh water resources and decrease of natural food, and so on. So there are many things to discuss. And this era of current human domination in the planet, as you probably know, has been often noted as Anthropocene. So human civilization has become a dominant force in shaping the conditions of the planet. And this can be well understood by one figure that I have put here to the slide, namely the amount of domesticated livestock, mostly cows and pigs, compared to the amount or biomass of wild mammals. So currently our livestock makes about 60% of total biomass, whereas wild mammals just are about like 4%, which is very, very unbalanced in any way. So it seems that the human civilization does not have much balancing counterforce that would confine our spread in the planet. And so my topic today is semiotics of Anthropocene, its connection to role of objects in semiotic models, then something that can be called iconic indexical ground, and then finally the concept of ecosemiosphere as one model that can be used to address ecological crisis. And I think that the global ecological crisis inevitably challenges semiotic theories. The very simple reason for that is that ecological crisis manifests itself in the level of material processes, in changes of temperature, in changes in the flows of matter and energy, how well different resources are available, and so forth. So it has to do with object world or material world. British environmental philosopher Kate Soper, more than 20 years ago, stated in her quite well-known essay, "What is nature?" that, and I quote, "It is not language that has a hole in its ozone layer, and the real thing continues to be polluted and degraded, even as we refine our deconstructive insights at the level of signifier. So ecological crisis brings out very vividly that semiotics does not have very suitable conceptual tools or analytical tools to take into account problems that reach into object level. And I think this crisis really makes a challenge to semiotics to problematize this divide between material and semiotic real, and to work with processes that surpass the threshold between these two. So that's a connection with the general topic of our Semiosalong this semester. From a semiotic perspective, Anthropocene manifests as massive multiplication and spread of abstract symbols that lack referential connection with biological and material real. This observation is probably best described by Jean Baudrillard under the concept of simulacrum. The process of semiotic systems becoming separate from the fabric of the world produces exceptionality and uniqueness in bulk. And we can very well see it in our everyday experience. Today, there's an enormous number of products, all advertised as excellent, millions of books and movies, all extraordinary, greater and greater productivity in Excel sheets and so forth. There are countless stories of success without the lack of measure or criterion to assess the processes behind the sign. Household products are presented in ways that make invisible their production and their ecological footprint. In social media, people often become replaced by their symbolic, ideal avatars. So it seems that that kind of thin layer of symbolic representations is starting to cover everything else that there are in the world. The common feature of all these instances is that the signs have become separate from the conditions of their appearance without sufficient reference to the object sphere, to the historical upcoming or to the material real. In moving towards semiotics suitable for analyzing Anthropocene culture, the threats of closed semiotic systems to global ecology needs to be recognized and critically analyzed. The deterioration of a referential dimension appears to be related with the growing detachment of humans from the rest of the life on Earth. Symbols, as we know, are based on human conventions and agreements. They cannot respond directly to changes in environmental and ecological processes. If in icons and in indexes, the connection remains with the object sphere, either by similarity or by a causal link, then this is not the case in symbols. Symbols, being by definition arbitrary and conventional, work effectively only for people who share the communication code and who are part of a given convention. The problems of human symbolic domination is well exemplified by the concept of dissent that was proposed by Australian semiotician David Lowe for describing environmental communication. He departed from Persian semiotics and highlighted a split between the environmental processes itself and human interpretation of this process as an important characteristics of the environmental conflicts. According to his view, environmental processes enter into environmental communication as dynamical objects in the sign, in the sense of Charles Peirce. For example, the pollutants in water act as a dynamical object, whereas their perceived characteristics and effects act as immediate objects of the sign. So David Lowe's concept of dissent as a split between dynamic and immediate object presumes at the same time that there is still some connection with the object domain and that sign can in principle have a referential connection to the environmental processes. But often this is not the case. At the same time, symbolic signs are still related with the physical world due to the matter and energy that is required to produce and upkeep various media and artifacts that embody signs. Internet communication needs servers, cables, and computers. Producing media content needs cameras, microphones, and special equipment. The symbols of social status are embodied into clothes, accessories, vehicles, buildings, and so forth. Need for new impressions and exotic experiences requires a complex infrastructure of air traffic, hotels, restaurants, beaches, resorts, and so forth. So even symbolic signs are embodied in our communication technologies, consumer goods, infrastructure, and cultural artifacts that all require matter and energy for their upkeeping, and that later become often obsolete and disregarded as waste. The extensive energy use and consumption is directly related to how human culture and semiotics have developed over the last century or two. The process that appears to be specific to Anthropocene semiotics is the degradation of the object in the sign. This tendency is observed by several people working in the field. Anthropologist Alf Hornbury has demonstrated the devastating effect of abstracted symbolic signs that he calls economical signs on a traditional local cultures. In Hornbury's view, economical signs are more abstract and more detached from human living practices in the ecosystem compared to other sign types that he distinguishes compared to linguistic signs and sensory signs. So these abstracted economical signs, they require sensory signs and linguistic signs as requisites, but at the same time they progressively detach themselves logically, but also phylogenetically from the prior one, dissembling discourse from experience and economy from culture. Tyler Bennett and Hello Bennett there has shown that he has used works of Charles Peirce and Terence Deacon, and has shown that overgeneralized symbolic signs lose their object dimension and degrade from triadic signs to degenerate dyadic forms that can be called memes. So symbols, if they become too self-contained, turn into memes and lose their representational quality. For an interpreter, the mass of abstract symbolic signs result in a positive, self-affirming and reassuring feedback, in cyclic amplification without correspondence or correction from the object world. Humans have seemingly total momentary control over a semiosis. In each moment, there are plenty of signs to choose from, and the paths of interpretation seem unconstrained and unlimited. But paradoxically, the more control humans have over semiotic processes, the more the semiosis turns into self-repeating and self-affirming auto-communicative cycle. Everything appears to be novel, and yet all is representation or mimicry. I think a suitable model for understanding this modern human condition can be derived from Jakob von Uexküll's functional cycle or Funktionskreis. This sign-mediated cycle describes perception and action spaces, Merkwelt and Wirkwelt, between animal organism as a subject and environmental objects. And you well know this material. The semiotic condition of modern human resembles, however, animal's position in a functional cycle where the object is degraded or removed. On the object side of the model, action directly converts into perception. The functional circle degrades to the autocommunicative loop, and the subject is left into repetitions with little new. So our ability to choose and connect with any representament results in shallow and passing interpretations. We are left chronically unsatisfied and in need to repeat. More and more input is needed to hold the same level of stimulation. Faster and faster need sign processes to happen for keeping up with themselves. More and more signs are needed, and as signs require matter and energy as a carrier for their upkeeping, this results more pollution and waste. In semiotics, I think in theoretical semiotics, the object in the sign model is often taken as something very self-evident, and it has received a little theoretical attention. I mean, usually in sign model, object, we just take it as such, and we really do not like put our attention too much into this. But I think this is very unfortunate, and object in the sign or for a sign are not distinct material bodies, but are much more dynamical and processual. Objects have their own history and sometimes also their own agency. Objects quite clearly for semiotics are not the same as objects for classical physics. In our earthly conditions, most objects as tangible entities of the world also, at least to some extent, semiotic. And what I mean by that is that if you think about soil below our ground, below our feet in the ground, then this is essentially a living organic matter that has been grown and decayed countless of times. And in a similar way, objects in our world already are many times recognized and remodeled as they have been parts of earlier semiotic associations, earlier sign relations. So it may be said that objects branch into the world like roots of trees, receding into causal connections and processes. And semiosis requires objects of the world as a certain counterbalance to function properly. So I think that instead of common sign models that like Percy's triad, we should think of semiosis in an ecosystem as something like a fabric composed of both semiotic and material connections and processes that influence one another. Semiotic and material are threads of the same fabric with different properties. This also means that from semiotic and especially from ecosemiotic perspective, I'm very skeptical about the concept of semiotic threshold, at least when we are talking about ecosystem or environmental crisis. Material patterns and physical processes give ground to characteristics of semiosis and communication, and also other way around. Semiotic processes shape material conditions and material objects. So the distinction between the two appears to be quite fuzzy and can be done probably just as a kind of formal distinction. Now, if you think about ecosystem, then organisms rely quite a lot to the presence of objects, both in their ontogenetic and their phylogenetic development. Objects can actualize to organisms in the form of environmental constraints, properties of the environment, and as resources. In many cases, organisms search for specific objects, recognize the qualities of these, how they provide physical support or protection, what is their nutritional value, what is their accessibility, and so forth. This relationship between organisms and things was recognized by Jesper Hofmeyr as a concept of semiotic scaffolding, where environmental and organismal structures form supports that enable an organism to reach next developmental stage, to develop some capacity that they would otherwise lack. If a new level of development is achieved, the thing becomes a part of organism's semiotic structure. An example on that I have used earlier is that young ibexes can defy steps and cliffs as counterstructures for learning how to move in their rocky habitat. In adult life, the male ibex can strategically use the mountain terrain to increase success in mating fights. These activities, however, are very closely related to the physical properties of sharp walls, where, well, only few species can move or survive. Kalevikul has provided a distinction between vegetative, animate, and cultural semiosis, and has indicated that non-human species use a much more iconic and indexical signs. Correspondingly, probably also the relationship to the object world is much more clearly presented for non-humans. So we can claim that in ecosystem there exists a connection between the properties of objects and interpretation, and accordingly between material and semiotic realms. Anthropologist Eduardo Kohn, working with languages and cultures of Amerindian nations, notes that icons and indexes create modalities shared by different animal species. And I quote, "Living dynamics are constitutively semiotic. The semiosis of life is iconic and indexical. Symbolic reference, which makes humans unique, is an emergent dynamic that is nested within this broader semiosis of life, from which it stems and on which it depends." So icons and indexes constitute a common semiotic ground for humans and non-human species alike, that is also connected to patterns and regularities of the material realm. This ground could be imagined like a fabric of different similarities and associations by which different species connect to one another and to potentials and affordances of the land. Semiotic ground is a bit language-like in the sense that it provides possibilities for interspecies communication and thus supports the coherence and stability of the ecosystem. But at the same time, this semiotic ground probably is much more heterogeneous and ambivalent compared to any human language. British anthropologist Andrew Whitehouse developed Eduardo Kohn's ideas further and tried to describe the properties of this semiotic ground. He also uses Tim Ingold, another British well-known anthropologist, Ingold's concept of meshwork to support his view. I quote, "This broader framework might be better thought of as a meshwork, a way of thinking about the world as emergent, fluid, and entangled that chimes with both Kohn's and Peirce's ontological claims. The lines, knots, and texture of the meshwork are themselves semiotic. Iconic forms are continually emerging in the continuous rebirth of the world. Materialized indexical associations are what things are made of. The meshwork is semiosis made flesh." So both Eduardo Kohn and Andrew Whitehouse connect semiotic ground with lived experience and the process of living. That is, the semiotic ground expresses itself here and now by the impressions, events, encounters, and experiences. By being distant from symbols, it defies abstractness, displacement, and generalization. This also makes a semiotic ground local, as it is connected with the specific rhythms and patterns of the place. Now, let us think for a second, and without much systematicity, what the semiotic ground could include in some natural ecosystem. We may say that it includes geographical relief and routes of movement, open and closed views, hideouts and shelters, obstacles, water bodies for drinking, flows of wind and directions of flyways, landmarks and other navigational aids, recognition of species mates, enemies, partners, and offspring, cycles of weather and circadian rhythms, morning choir of birds with its rhythms and pauses, rain that erases smells and odors, different pitches of sounds interpreted differently due to physical obstacles, light, a lot of light in different variations and hues, patterns of colors and shapes, fragmentation of landscapes, rapid alarm calls of various bird species that indicate danger, and so on and so on. So the semiotic ground is about emergence, making connection with one another. It's about activities and lived experiences. And upon this semiotic basis, more complex and more species-specific communication systems are built, like different courtship rituals or ritual fights, and also probably our symbolic communication systems and our languages. So for addressing ecological crisis, we probably would need to move towards human culture that is more receptive for ecological processes. And in Tartu semiotics, as you well know, the central concept to denote this entirety of cultural semiotic processes has been a semiosphere. So we can ask in following, what are the possibilities for grounding the semiosphere, that is, re-establishing the connection between our symbol-based science systems and iconic indexical ground that is in the center of semiosis in ecosystem. Originally, Lotman's semiosphere model characterized culture by formulating some of its main properties. Boundaries are related to homogeneity and individuality, and active translation processes on the markings of the semiosphere. Also, structural irregularity between different parts of the semiosphere, which relate to asymmetries and isomorphisms holding between different components and over different hierarchical levels. And I think many of these properties are also valuable in describing the cultural ecological complex that I have called the ecosemiosphere, following the terminology of Alfred Sievers from University of Utah. Also in ecosemiosphere, boundaries and asymmetries and irregularities arising from these probably play an important role in the dynamics and changing and developing of this cultural ecological complex. So we could define ecosemiosphere as a semiotic system comprising all species and their umbels alongside the diverse semiotic relations, including humans with their culture that they have in the given ecosystem, and also the material support structures that enable the ecosemiosphere to thrive. The ecosemiosphere is not just the sum of all living organisms but a complex web of dynamical relations in and between living and non-living. The ecosemiosphere would include material structures and patterns inasmuch as they take part in semiosis and are relevant for organisms constituting the ecosystem. Matter, for instance, may become relevant as affordances or meaning surfaces, or as media for communication, for instance, as a place for traces and tracks, or as resources that animals search for and that are related to their meaning making and ecofields. So if we think about the ecosemiosphere concept as a formal concept, as a formal research model, then it probably can be characterized by different levels of hierarchical complexity. There are human, cultural, symbolic, semiosis, and communication. There are various types of indexical and iconic semiosis of humans and non-human animals. And there are resources and surfaces of the physical environment with different perceptual affordances and different usability. Each of these hierarchical levels has its specific properties and dynamics. So if we think about resources and affordances, meaning surfaces, then they are mostly spatially limited. They are here and now, fixed in specific a place, whereas symbolic semiosis spreads very effortlessly via human communicative means. So we can describe each and every level as consisting of different activity centers that are connected via various semiotic processes, such as perceptual affordance, biotranslation, semiotic modeling, and semioside. And this description of ecosemiosphere is something that I have already written proof and also presented in some earlier papers. But now what's interesting here to combine a semiotic ground, or is this iconic indexical ground and ecosemiosphere concept, is that this indexical iconic ground seems to be very central for ecosemiosphere model, because it connects on one hand different biological species, enables their communication, their interaction, and at the same time it also kind of mediates and creates connection between material world, material processes and human cultural processes. So as mentioned earlier, in this iconic indexical ground or semiotic ground, there are similarities, repetitions, resemblances, causal relations, proximities, effects, associations, and directions. So this is what it is consisted of. It is also a layer of live presence, situatedness, local signscapes, and here and now experiences. For an ecosemiosphere model, what is important is a question of dialogic interrelations between semiotic ground on one hand and human symbol-based culture on the other hand. So the question about this dialogue, to what extent it takes place, to what extent it's possible, is, I think, important, because both of them have a different type of memory and consistency. I think one older concept that we can kind of recall here is a concept of co-duality that was proposed in the beginning of biosemiotics in the beginning of 1990s by Jesper Hofmeyr and Klaus Emmek, and later also developed by Kalevi Kull. And this is the idea that in living organic world, we often have a kind of interplay between two types of codes, and one type is analogic and other type is digital. And to have a kind of good dynamics, good development, and also the kind of stability and resilience, you need to have both in the kind of living organism or living world. So here, perhaps also we can consider this iconic indexical ground and then a symbolic human culture as a certain type of co-duality. And for strong eco-cultures, if we think about how to kind of develop or move towards a really ecologically sustainable and stable cultures, then this dialogic engagement, so that human culture would recognize and be open towards this iconic indexical ground and also to value that, this seems to have a central importance in my understanding. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And yeah, we are ready to take questions. Please, Oscar.
Thank you, Timo, for your talk. It was very interesting. How you expanded a bit from where you left last time, the development congress. And I noticed one very nice, I don't know if it's a coincidence of the primacy of Zoom. I mean, for them to just listen to me, right?
Okay.
I noticed a very nice thing that just happened, and then I will maybe make a question. The continuity between nature culture seen as a continuum, right? But it's not necessarily from a perspective, but it's like an intrinsic phenomena that is continuous. And the tension or the continuity between the passage from iconicity to indexicality and then to optionally symbolicity. So that's a very interesting, nice thing that was like in the background when I was listening to this. So my question for Timo would be, what do you have to say to these two types of interpretations about the semiosphere, or in this case, the ecosemiosphere? We could see it as a model, as a diagram, so to speak, about some semiotic phenomena, or as an actual semiotic phenomena that we can speak of. I'm on the second side of interpretations, so can you tell us about this difference, model or phenomena, or both? Yeah.
Yeah, that's very deep question. What I can say about this is that they are interrelated in the sense that probably you have both, in the sense that that you need to have a kind of recognizable phenomenon in the object level to be able to describe it, to be able to say something about it. Okay, so you need to have some sort of specificity of the semiosphere or ecosemiosphere in human culture or in like cultural ecological system. So to be able to work with a model. But at the same time, what model enables you to do is to provide a systemic description and to kind of draw your attention to specific processes, specific aspects, to bring them out, to work with them, and also to compare like different, let's say, eco-cultures through the model. So it's kind of well, dialogic or kind of reciprocal, cyclical relationship, which I think is quite common to like semiotic concepts and models. So it's not very specific to like a semiosphere model.
Right. So could we just agree provisionally that the ecosemiosphere is a way to map the continuity between nature-culture relations, for instance, or it's a way to map continuity, which is usually considered to be non-formalizable. So can we agree, sorry, that this concept, like the semiosphere concept, allows us to map this unformalizable in a way?
Well, yes, I think so, because I mean, every model has its specifics, its specific aspects, and I think this model, if we take this and if we use this, it allows us to pay attention to these interconnections, or well, also kind of dialogic relations between what is like human cultural domain and this what is going on in an ecosystem. So yes, it has this specificity.
Thanks.
Josh, please. I noticed you have,
Yeah, great talk. Thank you. It was really timely. Just a few days ago, I was doing a word search in Peirce's collected papers for ground. I'm really intrigued. Well, all the other references you make to ground, all the other thinkers that followed Peirce, I think, perhaps might be obviously more relevant and contemporary to the current questions you're raising and exploring. But I am really intrigued going back to Peirce in searching for the word ground in collected papers, like 200 results come up, mostly of colloquial usage. But there is one interesting usage in 2.228 where he talks about, the sign stands for something, its object. It stands for that object, not in all respects, but in reference to a sort of idea, which I have sometimes called the ground of the representamen. And he actually highlights the word ground. And I'm really intrigued with your thoughts on that, and also as it may relate to your distinction between immediate and dynamic object, because I could be wrong, but I'm really fascinated with the object. I don't think it's quite delved into enough. And I think there's a really, as I think you alluded to in your talk, a lot of rich potential. And I'm intrigued with, so basically the question is first and foremost, the distinction between immediate versus dynamic object, but also if you can comment on how Peirce might be relating object then to ground, and your thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you for a question. I really do not consider myself as a kind of specialist on Peirce, so I can try to be in dialogue, but with you, but not in very deep way. I have a feeling that what is a concept of ground for Peirce in relation to its model of sign is a bit different thing compared to what Eduardo Kohn and Andrew Whitehouse, the way how they are using this concept, because they still, as I also mentioned, they consider this kind of indexical iconic fabric or meshwork that is somehow shared, that is somehow common to different biological species, and also that we human have at least partial access as a ground of, let's say, semiotic processes. So as much as I know Peirce, I think the ground for Peirce is much more connected with the specific sign or specific type of sign. So I imagine that he can talk about iconic ground, indexical ground, and symbolic ground as something that are different, and with a reference to different ways how sign relation is consisted, or how it is kind of how it's emerging. And probably if you are interested, I think one author who has been working with this concept of ground in Peircean perspective is Swedish semiotician Göran Sonesson. So you may look what Göran Sonesson. It is in a couple of papers where he kind of also develops this concept. So what was the second?
Well, the second part. Well, first of all, let me say that that's great. I'm really much more sympathetic in my own work to a notion of ground, as I think you're characterizing, as this mesh, you know, like Cone and Whitehouse. And perhaps I'm trying to get Peirce. I'm trying to maybe see something in Peirce that is not there. So with that in mind, the second sort of part of the question was the distinction between the immediate and the dynamical object, and to what degree does that distinction highlight this more mesh-like interrelational notion of object, that this object is, I really liked how you were saying that the object, your notion of, what did you say, your notion of the object, more dynamical and processual. I couldn't agree more, and that has its own agency, its own accreted history. And anyway, yeah, so how it is the dynamical and immediate aspects of the object contribute to that processual nature of the mesh-like object.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I pretty much follow Peirce here. I mean, as it is in his sign model, that immediate object is something that we take as a kind of component of a sign, as it is perceived from, like, I don't know, first person perspective or from the interpreter's perspective. Whereas a dynamical object is something about which we do not have like a direct access, but that at the same time somehow initiates a sign, and we can know about it through kind of collateral experience. I think this is a concept that Peirce is using. But now, in regard to this mesh work, and kind of agency and dynamicity of the object, I think here, and I understand that there are different people who read Peirce differently, but my kind of preference would be to the direction that object and especially kind of dynamical object, that it really has a kind of agency to evoke sign or to determine sign in certain soft sense. So that this agency can be very real, and if so, then this of course gives a lot of kind of agency and livingness also to this iconic indexical meshwork or whatever it is. So it really becomes a kind of living tissue from where the processes start, and that can initiate different processes. But in general, I think that using these two types of object, immediate and dynamical, it's a very genius way from Peirce to really combine this object and material world, material kind of view, and then this more kind of idealistic sign and semiosis and interpretation perspective. So it's very great how he puts these two together.
Great, thank you.
Do we have another question from the audience or here? Because if not, I would have two questions. So one question is, so if I understood correctly, you are departing from semiosphere, and then you use this notion of ground to ground the semiosphere properly. But this ground, it sort of highlights this like commonalities or a sort of continuity across species. But then why would you not agree with a notion as the semiotic threshold? What would make it incompatible with, or did I misunderstand that?
Okay, I think the problem with semiotic threshold is that it often kind of tends to shade these specific qualities and specific properties that, let's say, material realm or object level has, and that have effect on semiotic processes that have effect on interpretation, and that could finally have effect on also human symbolic sign processes. So I mean, talking with thresholds, it's a bit like slicing, making semiotic process, or let's say this ecosemiosphere, into different slices. And I think that's okay for like formal reasons and formal typologies. But at the same time, we need to like pay attention and be very careful about that these vertical connections that go through all the thresholds are present and are very real, and a lot of ecological problems start from the kind of inconsistencies and ruptures between mostly like symbolic sign systems and symbolic semiosis, and then this iconic and indexical semiotic processes. So that's a kind of objection or problem that I have with thresholds, so that basically they are kind of covering up the specific relationship that the given object, given representative, and the given interpretant have with one another, if you can follow that. Mm-hmm. But now about this ecosemiosphere concept and how this iconic indexical ground and then the symbolic component is related, or how they work there. I think one of inputs that I have got is actually from system ecology, and from works like Eugene Odum and Bernhard Patten and others that who have showed and claimed that also we have certain type of self-regulation and feedback and kind of almost like dialogicity in this level of semiotic interactions between different non-human species who are kind of communicating mostly in iconic indexical level, who are well using some other modalities, but due to kind of behavior, the way how they respond to different signs and in communication, there is some kind of coherence or some sort of regulativity going on there. And so, I mean, from this ecosemios perspective, it's very important how this code-based and more kind of structured human symbolic communication, and then this more fluid at the same time also kind of intervened from different species, this iconic indexical ground, how these two modalities kind of come together, or how they interact. So basically what I want to say is that I do not want to like I do not try to put them together in the way that they would not be distinguishable. I do not want to like integrate them, But what's interesting is exactly this good duality. So how two systems which have different properties, different modalities, how they kind of relate with one another. What sort of kind of dialogue or interaction appears.
Okay, good. I will just briefly ask my other question before giving. Yeah. So my other question is what you said about objects and the way some properties of the object can sort of have a correlate in some properties of interpretation or the interpretation of the object. So like the materiality of the object sort of influencing the way in which it is interpreted. So first I thought, what was the difference from that idea, between that idea and the notion of affordance? But then you said that you would be ready to sort of ascribe some sort of agency to the object in a weak sense. But so that would be the difference, right? That you would, or how would you say it?
I think there is not much difference in the sense that you can also count affordance here as a part of this overall process. So proof affordance is proof the properties, but in affordances also, I mean, properties are often embodied in this cliff, in this mountain range where these coats are kind of climbing and moving. This is kind of real embodied or kind of physically present properties that influence this interpretation, and quite often also it is iconic. So yeah.
Thank you very much. And I will now pass the word, how do you say, to someone else. Armando, you have a raised hand, raised virtual hand. So please.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, first of all, I hope you have a good day, every one of you all guys. I'm from Mexico, and
yeah, if you can speak a bit louder, it would be good.
Okay, I'm from Mexico, and I'm a chemical engineer and a specialist in environmental impact. And I have done some research. I have information firsthand of the impact of the evolution of chemical industry in mankind and many other species. But anyway, I would like to know if you can recommend any lecture I can have about this topic, because I have seen that at least here in Mexico, the problem about this scenario is not about technology or availability of technology or knowledge on the people that need to know how to use it. It is about social aspects, right? I mean, we are talking about economical matters and social matters. I will say more social matters than economical even, right? And I think it could be the same situation in some other country. Is there any lecture you can recommend me? I can go to, because I find this presentation very interesting in the aspect of that I see here, like some kind of ecosemiotic utopia. But now we will need to address this utopia to the rest of the world, right? And we are very few to do so. So can you recommend something, any author or the work of someone that I can go to and study it? By the way, I liked very much your presentation. I think it's amazing. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think I should think a bit more about this. If you could write to me, it would be very nice. We can perhaps, figure out something. if you come from like chemical sciences or work with this type of issues, the one author that I think has written something in this direction, and that is kind of very precise analysis of environmental pollution and that kind of matters, is David Lowe, that I mentioned also in my talk, and his few papers on like environmental communication and how this environmental processes, pollution and then interpretation and semiotic mediation is related with one another. But there are of course more, but it really depends on what your interests more closely are. So if you could send me an email, then perhaps we can figure out some sources.
Thank you very much. I will send you an email today, Master. Thank you.
Hey, Timo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Just wanted to say thanks for the fabulous presentation, awesome presentation. And we're looking very much forward to seeing you here in Olomouc at the gatherings in biosemiotics in June.
We'll be there. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I think that if we don't have more questions, we can call it a night then. And yeah, I would then just thank both Usagi and Timo for their presentations, so nice presentations. And yeah, so then we can finish. And I would just remind you that in 2 weeks from now we will have we will have Josh and our good and dear friend Oscar Miyamoto presenting with us. So yeah, come on April 21st. Yeah, it will be on April 21st. So thank you for everything, and have a good night, and thanks again. Thanks again. Yeah, and see you next time.
Thanks.